Tonight on Talking Politics, a day late and a dollar short, or more like several $billion. In what's become an annual tradition, Massachusetts lawmakers have yet again blown past the state's budget deadline. What's holding things up? And does it matter? We'll dig into that ahead. But first, Governor Maura Healey is back in Massachusetts after a week-long trip to Dublin, where she courted tech jobs, pushed for broader trade ties, and celebrated the 30th anniversary of Ireland decriminalizing homosexuality.
The cause of human rights is woven through our shared history. We must stand strong and never go backwards. It was not so long ago when the story of Irish American unity and the story of gay liberation would never have been told together.
Healey has never been one to shy away from the national spotlight, but this trip was her first time stepping onto the world stage as governor. And my colleague and this show's usual host, Adam Reilly, had a front row seat for it all. Adam, thanks for being here on the opposite side of the table.
Thanks for having me. Good to be back.
Yeah, and you're freshly back after a whirlwind week. And I'd like to start with kind of a high-level question for you. How will we know? There were a lot of goals laid out for this trip, different things going on. How will we know if it was successful, and when will we see that?
I think we won't know for a long time. If we're talking about success in terms of the push for stronger trade ties that you mentioned, I talked to Greg Bielecki, Governor Patrick's former economic development secretary, before Healey's trip, and he said, when you've got industries like the ones we have in Massachusetts, like the ones that they have in Ireland, for example, you know, tech, clean energy, those were two areas that Healey was trying to hit on her trip. It can take a while for the conversations aimed at, for example, bringing an Irish company over to Massachusetts. It can take a while for those convos to bear fruit. He mentioned going to Israel with Governor Patrick and telling startups, hey, if you ever reach a point when you want to expand to the U.S. market, think about coming to Boston or to Massachusetts first. And he said that happened ultimately down the road, but it took a while for it to happen. So that was the how long argument. Remind me what the how long question. What was the other question?
What will success look like?
I think it would be, for example, let's say, in a year, Governor Healey sends out a press release saying, hey, we're delighted to inform you that this big Irish tech company is making Boston the first place it's expanding to in the U.S. Or this Irish tech company that already has offices in, you know, 2 other cities is opening up a new Boston office. It's going to be their biggest one, and it's going to employ 100 people, and 50 of those jobs are expected to go to Americans. Those are just, you know, hypotheticals, but I think that's the type of thing that would allow Healey to say, look at this trip I made was worth it, and it's actually going to redound to the benefit of people who live here in the state that I run.
Right, that's part of her mission on this trip, is to pitch Massachusetts as a place to do business. And the timing is kind of interesting. It comes the same week we saw the Healey team roll out these billboards in Florida and Texas,
super interesting,
highlighting Massachusetts as an inclusive and welcoming place, particularly for LGBTQ people. Was she operating off that same kind of inclusivity playbook abroad?
Very much the same general script, and she was also operating off the script that she's been using for her first half year as governor just here domestically, because we've heard her say, you and I have talked about this before just in the office, how it seems like any time she makes a public appearance and is talking about other states, she'll say, hey, if you're living in Florida, or if you run a business in Florida, and if you maybe don't like what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, think about coming here. Right, if you're Disney, say, and want somewhere that maybe doesn't have the best weather, it doesn't have weather that's as good as Florida, but if you like Massachusetts' commitment to abortion rights, commitment to LGBTQ rights, the way we treat immigrants here, think about coming to Massachusetts instead. She was making a similar case in Ireland, but with a little bit of a different twist. The case there was basically, hey, Ireland has become a place in the last 10, 15 years that is very much in line with where we are when it comes to values in Massachusetts. You were the first country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage in 2015. You legalized abortion for the first time in 2018 in this landslide election. If you are looking to set up shop in the United States, think about Massachusetts, because we're right on the same page as you when it comes to values. Can I throw in a couple other values-related arguments you made? Okay. There was one, a lot of times when people talk about diversity, especially here in Massachusetts. I think they talk about it like the benefits are self-evident, like it's good for its own sake, so you should embrace it. She made an argument in that speech to the Senate that I hadn't heard her make before, an economic development argument for diversity, basically saying if you've got teams of people working on really tough, thorny issues, like the ones we're all going to be working on in the years to come, diverse workforces do better because diverse workforces that are based in places that allow their members to be fully who they are, fully and authentically themselves, are going to get better results because of that freedom. Sort of saying this is why it will work better from an economic point of view, which I hadn't heard her say before. She also was making an argument saying, essentially, I talked about the types of industries that maybe both Massachusetts and Ireland have. She was saying, we both prioritize industries that accomplish morally commendable goals. We're fighting climate change. We're developing vaccines that save lives. So that's a way of, I think, making Massachusetts sound good, also making Irish companies feel good about the work they do, while also suggesting that there's a commonality that could bring them over here.
Not just on the values, but about how the values contribute to the economy.
Yep, exactly.
And when we hear the governor make those kind of values-based pitches here, the pushback that we do get locally tends to be along the lines of, well, it's great that you believe that and your politics are like that, but how am I supposed to live there? How am I supposed to afford housing, childcare? How can I be my authentic self at work if I can't commute there in the morning through the traffic? Were you hearing any of those arguments from the people she was speaking to in Dublin?
You're right. That's the pushback that we hear, especially because we've got tens of thousands of people moving out of the state. We're losing residents. So there's clearly a tension there, or it's not as simple as she might like people to think it is. I didn't hear anyone making those arguments explicitly in the public events that I went to. Someone did mention to me after a public tech event where the cost of housing didn't come up, and I said, hey, I thought that maybe that would be an issue here, something that would be discussed. Someone after that event pointed out to me that tech companies want to go where the best talent is, and that they are able to compensate their workers well enough that even though they might not be able to get as much bang for their buck, for example, if they were to come to Boston as if they came to North Carolina, generally speaking, the financial pressures for people working in that industry are not going to be as strong as they are for people maybe who aren't making that much money. There was, at that same event, a tech leader who said, hey, our workers, they love the diversity here in Dublin, and they also love being able to take public transit to and from work. I thought that there might be a discussion of challenges that we're facing with the T here. That did not occur publicly there, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some of the closed events that I wasn't able to attend, if maybe Healey talked a little bit about some of the challenges that she might not have wanted to highlight in a public setting.
Sure, able to be a little more candid.
A little more candid, and maybe say something like, in all honesty, you need to know that the last administration left our public transit system in much more of a mess than I expected. We're working on it. Again, that's just speculative, but if she wanted to make a point like that, it'd be more comfortable making it in a closed press environment than an open one.
Sure, that would make sense. So we've talked about the policy side of it. Let's talk a little bit about the politics of it. There was another major anniversary she was commemorating, which was of John F. Kennedy's trip to Ireland. And we actually have a little bit of sound to play from her speech to the Irish Senate, where she invoked John F. Kennedy multiple times.
President Kennedy said 60 years ago, "The supreme reality of our time is our indivisibility as children of God and the common vulnerability of this planet." We have a different understanding of our planet's vulnerability today, but this truth remains unchanged. If we embrace our shared destiny, then we will not only meet the climate challenge, we will also demonstrate the unity this world needs to meet all of the challenges that confront us.
And so there's obviously a lot of similarities in a Massachusetts Democrat of Irish heritage visiting Dublin. But the notable difference is that JFK was president, Maura Healey is the governor. Are you able to read any tea leaves about her political ambitions or how she might be positioning herself in the national political arena?
I've been trying to think through the sort of political upside for her after this trip. One of the Irish senators, after she gave that speech, suggested that if in fact she were to find herself in the White House one day, like JFK did, perhaps she could extend the members of the Irish Senate the same hospitality that they had showed her on that day. And, of course, my ears pricked up because here's someone speculating about a Healey presidential run. I don't know, though, we don't know what the governor's ambitions might be beyond being governor. And I don't know if a trip like this, I could imagine it if she wanted to run for higher office down the road. It's part of her political resume now, right? She's able to say she addressed the Irish Senate on the 30th anniversary of the decriminalization of homosexuality there. And she's been able to work on themes, or was able to work on themes in the trip, like the ones we heard her working on there, invoking JFK, that could be part of a speech to a broader audience down the road. But I was not left after watching this trip thinking, oh, get ready to say goodbye to Governor Healey after one term. She clearly wants to move on to bigger and better things. And I don't know. I mean, if an Irish senator would like to see her in the White House, that's notable. But there's so many other questions to weigh before. But I mean, my thoughts went in the exact same direction as you when I heard that. That was pricked up.
What kind of reception did she get? Was it what we see here, where it's a huge major visit, like if a president comes to Ireland, or?
It wasn't. There was a lot of attention paid to her appearance, which you mentioned a moment ago at the Irish Emigration Museum about the 60th anniversary of Kennedy's speech. That was a big event with a few different people speaking, including Claire Cronin, the U.S. ambassador to Ireland. It was very well attended. Healey was being interviewed by Irish media after that. But I think that I, maybe because of my Massachusetts provincialism, expected there to be just throngs of Irish media following her around as if she was president when she went on this trip. And in the first event that I went to at Enterprise Ireland, this group that works to help Irish companies expand overseas if they want to, I think I was the only member of the media there, and I was kind of surprised, thinking, okay, where are the local TV stations? Where are the newspapers? But as you say, it's a reminder that whatever might be in store for her down the road, however important she is here in Massachusetts, she is still a governor, and she was paying a visit when she gave that speech to the Irish Senate. She's paying a visit to the Irish Parliament, this national governing body, so it's not quite the same level for now.
Right, kind of like the situation here where you might have a foreign dignitary visit the State House, but unless you're caught in traffic behind their motorcade, you might not know what's going on.
That's I think, a reasonably good comparison. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, cool. Well, very quickly, do you think the people of Ireland had any thoughts about Massachusetts and how we're doing things here?
I can't tell you if they did beyond the very small settings that I saw Healey operating in, but I can tell you, I mentioned the senator suggesting she could run for president down the road. There was another senator who basically said, as she is a very liberal, very progressive senator. She said, as the United States seems to have its democracy falling apart in slow motion, and we watch from here in Ireland, you're a beacon of hope in the United States political landscape. For the people she was addressing, the reception seemed really warm, and they seemed to like what the governor's doing and where we're at.
Awesome. Well, that's a really interesting perspective to hear. And Adam, thanks for, taking a moment out of your jet lag that I'm sure you're dealing with to come fill us in.
I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy to be on the other side of the desk talking to you. Thanks,
excellent.
Katie.
Thanks for your time. Next up, state lawmakers have officially blown past their deadline to pass a budget in time for the new fiscal year. It's something of an annual tradition here in Massachusetts. The state government has failed to get a budget in place in time for the new fiscal year every year since 2010. Current spending levels have been extended to cover the gap, but as of now, state departments and organizations are in the dark about how much money they'll have to work with in the year ahead. Lawmakers still haven't found a path forward on a long-awaited tax package either, leaving a lot still up in the air. So where does the budget debate stand now, and what kind of impact do these delays have on the state? To discuss, I am joined now by Lisa Kaczynski, author of Politico's Massachusetts Playbook, and Doug Howgate, president of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. Doug, Lisa, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And Doug, I want to start with you. It's been a long time now since Massachusetts has managed to start the fiscal year with a full budget in place. We, of course, have these interim budgets, so we don't have a threat of a government shutdown like you hear about in Washington. But with that in mind, does it matter that we're entering, fiscal 2024 without a budget in place?
So I think there's a couple ways to think about that. I think the most important thing, as you referenced, is are government provision of services going to continue? Can people continue to access government as they would in a normal day? And the answer to that is yes. And so it's not that when the clock strikes 12 on June 30th, all of a sudden people can't, do what or access what government does. I think the challenge is more like any deadline, when you kind of go past it one year, go past it another year, go past it another year, you run a greater and greater risk that if there's a real breakdown in negotiations, you could end up with a significantly delayed budget, which then does start to impact provision of services. We saw that probably about 20 years ago, and we haven't seen it since then, and hopefully we won't this year as well. But I think that's the big concern as you start to kind of creep past that deadline. It's not necessarily the day-to-day, it's really kind of what happens if there's a breakdown and then all of a sudden it's significantly delayed. I will also say it is something, it's part of the, what credit rating agencies and others look at when they consider the fiscal health of the Commonwealth. It's certainly not the only thing, and the state recently got a credit rating upgrade, but it is one of those factors too.
Absolutely. I know a few years ago, the credit rating agency Moody's warned Massachusetts and other states with late budgets that it's a sign of government weakness to have that continually drag on. Lisa, from your perspective, do people on Beacon Hill see it that way? Are they worried about the fact that there's a pattern of late budgets?
Beacon Hill lawmakers are really kind of greeting this with a shrug right now. It's funny because I reached out to some longer-time state lawmakers, as in people who were in the legislature back when the budgets did pass on time before 2010. And I was like, maybe they're upset about this. Maybe they'll say something about this, that this is bad for government or something like that. And they all kind of greeted it with a shrug. It's so par for the course on Beacon Hill at this point, and especially because there is that interim budget in place that at least keeps things moving. While some people who need state funds are in limbo, at least the state, as we've said, isn't shutting down. But even seasoned lawmakers who know what it's like to have a budget on time are just kind of shrugging their shoulders and moving on.
Right. And I do want to note that negotiations have started. They're underway. It's not like people are just sitting around. So I want to ask both of you, but Lisa, maybe I'll stick with you. What do you see as some of the sticking points between the House and the Senate as they try to iron out a final budget?
One of the interesting things, and this is something that's gotten a lot of attention already, is online lottery. There are a lot of policy sections that are attached to the budget, and things that like allowing for online lottery. And the House wants this, the governor wants this, and the Senate doesn't want it. And it's something that we have to keep in mind here. Like some things the different chambers won't put in their budgets, their budget proposals, as bargaining chips. And then there's some things that they're really against. And I'm curious how that one goes in particular, because the Senate has always been the more reluctant chamber when it comes to kind of expanding gambling options. We saw that with sports betting, where they did pass it eventually, but it was with kind of a lot of pushing and shoving and reluctance and other horse trading that went with it. So that's something that I'm curious to see how it goes. And also permanent funding for free school meals, something that the House included, but the Senate and the governor have thought about doing through, other types of spending plans.
Doug, I know you at Mass Taxpayers Foundation look pretty closely at the differences between the two budgets. What do you see as some of the major ones?
Sure. So I'd echo what Lisa said in a couple places. Normally you have to reconcile spending differences. And the way a budget normally works is the revenue templates that the House and Senate use are pretty similar, where spending can differ more. And so what usually happens when you have to reconcile those two budgets is you have to prioritize. And some spending things aren't going to make it in that final budget. That's always a challenge. And it's kind of enhanced this year because of spending related to the surtax, which is where that universal school meals comes in, some different spending provisions on the MBTA, higher education. So those would be some real kind of spending areas where I think it just takes a little time and complication to resolve. And then policy, you don't see as many policy sections, certainly the first year of a governor's administration, first year of a legislative session. But as Lisa mentioned, whether it's in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants, online lottery, a few of those things, there are some notable policy areas that's in one branch, not in the other. So how do you compromise and kind of make a deal within that?
Sure, and you're referring to the state's new tax on incomes over $1 million.
Exactly.
And that's one kind of tax policy wrinkle we have going on this year. The other is that both branches of the legislature have passed tax relief packages. That's also being negotiated. And I want to ask you, Lisa, about a theory I've been kind of batting around and see what you think. I've been wondering if the tax relief negotiations and the budget negotiations, which involve some of the same players, are going to be linked, where we might not see one bill get finalized until we see the other. What do you think about that?
I would say that's a pretty safe bet. I mean, that's sort of what we've seen before, where you have the same two people, the House and Senate Ways and Means chairs who are leading negotiations on both, they are sort of already linked, in terms of through the budget. The Senate had carved out, the nearly $600 million for it in their budget. So these were linked going into negotiations. And that's sort of how it ended up last year, where we saw the budget and then we saw the tax relief package, kind of in quick succession. And ultimately, of course, that got derailed last session because of other factors. But, these really are kind of linked, and I would expect to see them come in pretty rapid succession when lawmakers do reach agreements on them.
Right. And Doug, when we're talking about a budget that's upward of $50 billion, how big a deal is this kind of tax relief question when it's, a few $100 million or?
In any budget, the vast majority of spending proposals are going to be common between the two budgets. So it really usually is about between $1 billion and $800 million of difference, which is where a lot of the discussion negotiation takes place. I think the good news is on the tax relief proposal, both budgets kind of account for about $600 million in relief in fiscal year 2024, which is the upcoming year. And we're going to publish something next week that shows you can probably include everything, if you delay implementation of a couple things and still fit within that $600 million kind of budget for tax relief. And so it wouldn't necessarily be the case that you have to include some or not include some, but obviously there are many different ways to get to that point. But that could kind of complicate negotiations, exactly as you say.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to be staying tuned for that.
Definitely.
And I want to ask you, too, about a recent report the Mass Taxpayers Foundation put out with the conference committee preview looking at the negotiations, in which you highlight really one way that this budget is different from other late budgets, saying this is likely to be the first time in several years where the resources aren't sufficient to support all spending. Do you think that dynamic is something that lawmakers are working through?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to note is this year's budget is pretty standard. What wasn't standard is the last two budgets. So in both of the last two budgets, during this time period, budget makers were able to upgrade revenue assumptions by billions of dollars because we saw about a 40% increase in tax collections over a 2-year period. So you didn't have to make tough decisions necessarily between, are we going to go with this higher number here or this higher number here, because you were able to support it with newfound tax revenue. This is a standard budget where we don't anticipate them really changing the revenue playbook that they need to make all the spending work within. And so when you have different ideas on the Senate and the House, usually for new things or expanded program, it is going to come down again to figuring out how you prioritize those things.
Right. And, Lisa, another difference that we see this year compared to the past couple years is that we have a new governor in office. We have Maura Healey. We have full Democratic control on Beacon Hill. Do you think that is changing the way lawmakers are approaching their budgeting this year?
I do, yeah. And that's definitely the case if you take kind of the budget and the tax relief plans as a whole. I mean, think about it last year. A lot of the stuff that the current Democratic governor is proposing, especially in her tax relief package, are items that first came from the Republican governor, Charlie Baker, and specifically to focus on the capital gains, the cut to the short-term capital gains rate that's being proposed. That was something that Republican Governor Charlie Baker had put forward and that both the House and Senate said no to. Now that there's a Democrat in the corner office, you have the House saying yes to it, the Senate still saying no, but that's still one chamber that had nixed it last year that's now in favor of it this year. And you can see this in a couple of different ways where lawmakers, just do seem to be a bit more willing now that Democrats have full control on Beacon Hill to move forward with some things that they were a little bit reluctant to do under the Republican governor.
That's right. And I know, of course, once there is a budget deal, Governor Maura Healey will get 10 days to review it, and we'll see what she ultimately agrees with. Doug, can you give me a sense of how different, how far lawmakers might have strayed from the original budget proposal Governor Healey put forward?
I think in many important ways, people often kind of deride a governor's budget as, oh, the House and Senate just ignore that and do their own thing. But when you look at the fundamentals of both the House and the Senate budget, you see the framework that Governor Healey put forward on March 1st, right? Certainly starting with tax relief, both in terms of the scope and the provisions. But then when you look at some of the major proposals for community college for Massachusetts residents 25 and older, the Mass Reconnect program, when you look at investments in workforce, when you look at the continuation of child care operation grants, these were three things that were kind of a big selling point of the governor's budget, and you see those in the House and Senate as well. Now, as you mentioned, you see some unique things in addition. The House universal school meals, policy proposals related to in-state tuition, again, for undocumented immigrants on the Senate side, a lot of spending proposals related maybe to higher education. So there's always some differences. But I think a lot of the kind of bones and foundation of this budget you saw in Governor Healey's original proposal.
Okay, so, that should maybe make it a little easier to review. Maybe you'll see more working around the margins and a tighter focus on smaller things, a lot of ways that could play out. And, as we're talking about this late budget, Lisa, I'm hoping you can explain maybe for our viewers who are watching who might not be as familiar with the process of Beacon Hill, why we don't really know where the negotiations stand and why there is a question mark over everything. The whole process is shrouded in mystery a little bit still at this point.
Yes, it is. And that's because these conference committees, as they're called, these groups of 6 lawmakers, 3 from the House, 3 from the Senate, that are appointed to kind of hash out the differences between bills, both the budget, tax relief, and anything else that comes through the chambers with significant differences. They do this all behind closed doors. When these negotiations start, there's a very brief bit that's kind of open to the public. Reporters get to ask some questions, and then they shut it down. And it all plays out behind closed doors, the lobbying, the negotiations. We don't get to see it as reporters. The public doesn't get to see it, just watching in on Beacon Hill. And it will kind of very quickly emerge at some point with little to no warning, as kind of whatever deal they've been able to hash out. And that's kind of why we don't know where it is. And the lawmakers who are involved in these negotiations really do clam up with reporters. Not that they talk that much before, but it gets particularly quiet when it comes to these very presumably tense and complicated negotiations.
All right, so I guess we'll see what's going to happen there and when a budget emerges and what it looks like. Doug Howgate of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, Lisa Kaczynski of Politico Massachusetts Playbook, thank you so much for taking the time to walk through it with us. And that's it for tonight. Thank you, but do come back next week. And tell us what you think. The email is talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. You can find me on Twitter. I'm @Katie Lannan, or you can send any and all complaints to @ReillyAdam. For now, thanks for watching and good night.
Next time